here today to show you how to make a loaf of bread. We're gonna start off with mixing our dough. I've already pre-scaled our flours and our salt and the water. I like to do things in grams because it makes the math much easier, and I'm not the greatest at math. We have water that's around 100 degrees. It's gonna cool off pretty quickly. With the sourdough starter, you don't want the temperature to get too hot because it can damage your yeast. Anything below about 110 is all right. And then like when you're pouring it into a cool bowl, the temperature decreases even further. Here we have our leaven. So we can, one like cool little tip for seeing if it's ready is you can do a float test on it. So I have some water that's just like out of the tap water. One key thing to checking like any bit of your dough is that you want your hands to be wet, because otherwise it sticks to you and then you're toast. You are absolutely toast. So you want to get your hand wet and then take a little pinch off. So you don't want to degas it too much because then it will definitely not float. But I like to pinch a little chunk like that and pinch it off with my other hand, which I also got wet. And then, oops, I waited a little too long. A little stuck. You can see it's floating in there. It's very buoyant, so I think we're good to go. So we're gonna add that to our water that we have here. So I'm doing 20% levain. You can change this. This is like something that you can always kind of mess with the amounts for like flavor, for the amount of time you have to ferment, like anything. It's just like experience. 20% is like a pretty easy amount to start with just because it's easy to do the math. So I'm just washing my hands off a little bit in the extra water, just because the less dough you have stuck on your hands, the less that's going to go down your sink and the less that's going to get stuck down your sink. Now I just have the leaven in that warm water. And so I like to break up the leaven in there a little bit. You don't have to because it's going to get all mixed together anyways. But I like to break it up because then I know for sure that it's all mixed in once I get the flours and stuff in there. Here are my two flours. I have a Type 80. They're both from Central Milling and they're both whole milled and they're both California grains. We're doing a 35% whole grain. So this is some Yakora that's whole grain, and then this is also Yakora, but it's a Type 80, so it's been sifted, so it's much whiter. And we're just gonna add that into our water. Get that. And then you can mix this together with your hands. It's not, I'm just making a single size loaf, so I actually like to mix it with like a butter knife, or you could use like a long thin spatula, just because it's very easy to clean. Less dough in the sink. And so really you're just mixing it together. You don't have to mix it too aggressively. We're going to do an autolyse, which is going to allow the flour to hydrate. It's going to make it a lot easier to mix. Like the main reason I like let it do the autolyse and rest is just because it makes it a lot easier to mix later, to develop the dough later. So you can see it's like very, very shaggy. I'm just trying to get water on all of that flour. And then we're just gonna let it rest. So you could mix it more than that or just about that. It's, you know, I still see a few little dry bits, but that's all right. You don't have to worry too much because we're gonna mix it a lot more because we're gonna add salt in about 30 minutes. So I'm gonna cover this with plastic wrap. If you have one of those reusable silicone tops, this is the perfect time to use it. I don't happen to have any of those, but just a little plastic wrap also works. We've mixed this together and now we have our water, our leaven, and our flour all mixed together, and we're just letting it rest. The flour is absorbing the water, particularly that whole grain. It's like hydrating the bran, like the little brown bits and everything, so it makes it much easier to mix later. So we're gonna let that rest for 30 minutes. Really, it can be like between 15 minutes and an hour. It's like whenever you remember. This is our dough that was autolysing, so you can see it's still shaggy, but if I pull it, you can see how well hydrated it is, and like already you can see it's like holding up pretty well. So now we're gonna add our salt. So I like to, it depends on the day for me. Sometimes I just mix the salt in with no water. It doesn't really matter. Today I reserved a little bit of water to help the salt kind of dissolve. So I held back about 5%. This dough is gonna end up being 85% hydration. And that's just because we want the dough to stay nice and moist on the inside, and the whole grain needs a little bit of extra water. So I just press the salt. I press the salt in. And then I like to give it a little fold over to make sure that I'm getting that salt mixed in. And you know, you don't have to be too aggressive now because we're going to be giving it a few folds later. At this point, I like to take the opportunity. I have a little rounded scraper that's perfect for this. I like to scrape down the sides because the more of that flour mixture that's getting into the dough is less that you have to clean later. And I am definitely a lazy cleaner. So I just like to get that mixed in there, make sure that our salt is pretty well mixed, and then we're just gonna let it rest again. So the resting is really important in bread because you're developing this gluten, which gets tight when you touch it a lot, and so it's important to let it relax because if you overwork it all at once, it starts to tear. So I like to let it rest for at least 20 minutes, but you could let it rest for, it kind of depends on your schedule and your dough. If your dough is very tight, it may take a little bit longer to relax. If it's very, very loose, then you may want to fold it a little bit more often. So you want to wait at least 20 minutes, but up to 45 minutes or an hour, just depending on when you remember. So this is our dough we mixed. We incorporated this salt about 30-ish minutes ago. So now we're gonna give it its first fold. So water is your friend. Definitely get your hands wet. Plenty of water, but not so much that you're kind of getting water in there, because you can definitely affect the hydration of your dough if you're getting too much water inside of there. So you're kind of, with your hands, you're kind of loosening it from the edge, and then you're gonna pull up and kind of fold it right over. And you kind of do that in each of the cardinal directions, kind of. So it's going to be 4 ways. So you can see that it's like holding together really well. You can tell it's like nice and relaxed because you can really stretch it up without tearing it too much. You'll get like a few little tears on the back, but that's all right. And by the 4th fold, it's definitely going to be much tighter than that first one. So I like to kind of turn it over. You don't have to do this. I just kind of like to make it all nice and round in there. But there we go. So that's our first fold. So we're gonna have 2 more folds after this. And you just keep the cover on it so that it doesn't get a skin. You don't want it to dry out. We're just getting our fingers wet so that the dough doesn't stick. And we're just gonna kind of loosen it up on the edges, and we're gonna just pull it up and fold it right over. And you can like see already that there are like air bubbles developed in there. That's great. That is a good sign. It also won't, at this point, it won't be super sticky. The first one, it'll be much more sticky. This one, it's like not sticking to my fingers at all. It's very lively. I can feel the air in there. It feels super bouncy. So this is looking great, and it's like super clean. That was our 3rd fold, so we're just gonna let it rest, and we'll divide this in a little while. This dough I mixed a few hours ago, and I'm gonna just pinch off a little chunk and then cut it off with that other hand. So I have this little chunk. It's not stuck to my fingers at all. And then I'm just gonna let it rest in there. And so this guy, I can tell that I trapped one really large bubble on there. So I'm just gonna, I don't want to be cheated by that, but it's still floating. So this guy's ready to cut. You can either have a metal bench scraper or a plastic bench scraper. This is a bowl scraper, so it's really handy to get down in the curved edges. I'm just going to use a plastic scraper, but you can get the nicer metal scrapers, whatever you kind of like. In a pinch, I have used a lot of just like anything flat. You could use like the side of a spatula if you need, like whatever you happen to have that's like just a straight edge. That'll help you kind of in our pre-shape. So I'm just gonna get this out of the bowl. I like to keep my fingers a little bit wet. So there's kind of two ways to divide. You can divide by sprinkling flour on it and it won't stick to anything because of the flour, or you can do it with water, and I kind of like that because it's easier to clean up. You just make sure that you're keeping your hands a little bit wet, and with your bowl scraper, this doesn't need to be wet because your scraper is gonna prevent it from sticking onto there. Plus, the fermentation is holding it all tight, so like your network, the bread wants to stay as a whole piece of itself. So you kind of use that to your advantage. So I'm just scraping this guy out. And I'm just gonna set him right down on our bench. And I like to make sure I scrape all of the little bits out of the bowl because it's easier to clean later. And then with our scraper, I like to make sure that this hand that's going to kind of be the assistant hand is wet. I have a little dough stuck to my finger there, so I'll just make sure it's all incorporated into that guy. I like to make sure this hand is a little wet. You can make this hand a little bit wet too. You want to make sure that you're tensioning the outside of the dough because this is going to kind of keep it in that shape that you want, sort of your final shape. You're like setting yourself up for success. So like every step in bread making, there's like not that many touches that you do, but each touch kind of builds on the last one. So for this, we're just trying to shape it into like a nice tight ball. So this first move, I like to kind of do the setup, and then I'm stretching it across. So you can kind of see it's like getting tighter across the top, and you're gonna be able to tell that it's like nice and tight because it's like kind of matte, and you can like see little bubbles in there. So you just want just like that. It's like a nice tight ball, and we can just like let it rest just like that. So we're gonna let it rest again, just like at least 20 minutes or so. We just want it to relax so that when we shape it, it's gonna hold its shape and we won't tear it. Because you never want to be tearing your gluten because you spent so much time building it. So it's like we just need this guy to relax, and then we'll go to our final shape. Okay, so we pre-shaped this dough 20 to 30 minutes ago. It's still a little bit tight, but we're gonna go on it as long as you're gentle. I don't know, definitely could rest a little bit longer, but this is kind of where the flour comes into play. So right now, this outer edge is going to become the crust of your bread. So if you keep this tight, but you don't want to tear it, then you're gonna get that like loaf that kind of stands up, opens up really nice. So you want to make sure that you're gentle with the outside of your loaf. So I'm gonna sprinkle a little bit of flour on top of my little loaf, and then I'm gonna pick it up and flip it on its. This side is gonna be down because this is gonna be the outside, and I'm gonna be shaping it so that this gets tighter but does not get torn. You definitely don't want to tear the outside. So left a little bit behind. So now he's on his back. So I'm gonna shape it into a batard. I have a small basket, but you could also shape it into a round. Like I just have a bowl with a little towel in it. This is it's just a towel that I cut in half so that I could have more towels. And then I sprinkled some rice flour in there. You can see the rice flour, and the dough is just going to sit in there. And the rice flour helps it to not stick. You could use regular flour. You just might need to use a little bit more, and the loaf will look a little dustier. So we're just going to do a short little batard. So I like to, oops, I got a couple little herbs on there. So I like to fold it. You kind of fold each side in halfway, so you're kind of making a little tent or an A or something like that. You kind of orient it so that the skinny side's at the top, and then you're going to do some folds down. If you see a really big bubble that's not popping, you can feel free to pop it, but you're just going to roll it down, and with each roll you're getting that edge tight, nice and tight, and then you just kind of seal it on that back end. You can see the seal. So I just pressed one side to the other side, and if you don't have too much flour, it'll really easily stick on there. And you can tell this dough, you know, it's not wanting to stick to anything else, and that's perfect. So now you have a little loaf of bread. And so, like, to pick it up, I like to just roll it into my hands like this. So you want to keep track of where your seam is, because your seam is going to go up, because remember, we're going to flip it out over, so this is going to be the bottom. So right now it's going to be the top, then it's going to be the bottom in the end. So we're just going to set it in there, and there you go. If you want to make a round, there's so many different ways to make a round. You can do this in a similar way, but make sure that you keep it really narrow, so you're kind of rolling it down and making like a big hamburger kind of. Or you can kind of round it with your bench knife, kind of similarly to how I did it for the pre-shape. It depends on the dough. I personally like batards because you can get a lot more slices out of it, more sandwiches, more toasts. But the rounds are nice if you just have a bowl, because you could do this with anything. You could, like, any size bowl, really. I have done it in colanders, because you can get, you know, a colander for $1 at the dollar store. So now that I have my dough that's shaped, I'm going to let it proof, so it needs to relax, and it'll get a little bit puffier, and then I'm going to put it in the fridge, and then I can bake it anytime. Your lom can be anything. It could be, I have a chopstick here, it could be a coffee stirrer, it could be a pencil maybe, a very thin pencil. Really do anything. You're just going to flex that blade so that the holes kind of line up, because you have this entire open backside. You're going to insert it right in the bottom and right out through the top, and then let it unflex, and it'll just be on there right like that. In here I have some rice flour mixed with regular flour. You can use a little regular flour. You could put parchment down if you were really worried that the bread's going to stick. But our pots are preheated. I've never had a dough stick inside my pot unless I burn the bottom, so you're pretty safe, but you can put a parchment in there if you're worried. So I've preheated my oven to 550, which is just as hot as my oven goes, and I put my 2 pots in there. So I have 2 different types of cast iron. I have this cast iron, which we're going to put the bread down into the lid here, and then we're going to flip the top over, so that just makes it easier for scoring, but it makes it much more difficult to take the lid off later. This one is kind of the opposite. You're going to put the bread down in the bottom, and we're just going to remove the lid, but then it makes it much harder to score because your fingers can touch the edge, so you just want to be careful. I personally like this kind of, ooh, they're smoking a little bit. Yeah, pot holders, just because it gives me a little extra grip, but you can also use flat ones. You just want to make sure that you don't accidentally bump your hand inside your oven anywhere, because you will burn yourself. So here we are. We got our two loaves. I made the recipe so that one loaf fits pretty well into one pot. But if you have a bigger pot, you can make a bigger bread. If you have a smaller pot, you can make a smaller bread. Whatever kind of fits your space. So I'm just sprinkling a little bit of this rice flour mixture on these are the bottoms of the breads, and I'm gonna flip them out on here. So I actually like to flip them out onto my hand. So I like to flip it out into my hand and then kind of place it onto the pot. You can also flip it directly onto the pot. It's up to you. Once you've done it a couple times, you figure out what you like to do. So I like to flip it out and kind of uncover it. This is just like a piece of cloth that I floured, and then just set it right in there. And that guy's ready to go. We're gonna score it and put it in the oven. But I'll show you one other way to get your bread into the pot. So if you're really worried about your fingers going in there, you can also turn it out onto a parchment paper. And same deal. We're just gonna turn it out, but then you can lift it up with the parchment paper and kind of slide it down in there. And there you go. You can also score it beforehand if you like, but I'm gonna show you scoring down into the pot. So I placed my two loaves into our preheated pans, and now we're gonna score them. You can score them any way you like. I've seen a lot of really cool designs. I'm just gonna do just a pretty simple score. For a pot like this where you're putting it into the lid, it's much easier because you can get your hand down and you can get like a more shallow angle. But really you just want to make sure that you're scoring into the loaf so it has that ability to expand out of the score. So I'm just gonna do just a simple line. So I'm entering on this little edge, but my cutting edge is kind of right in that center area. And you just want to be confident about the score. You're just gonna pull it along, and see all those little bubbles in there? That's a good sign. That means we've got some fermentation going on in there. Another way, since you're reaching down into here and the pan is quite hot, you can score like this with I have a chopstick, but with your lom like this. Or if you want to do something a little bit more detailed, you can actually take it off of there and then hold it. You have to be very careful of both sides and kind of score it like that. So I'm just gonna rotate the pot a little bit. So I'm gonna do like a similar score. You're not gonna be able to get, your angles are gonna be a little bit more difficult because you'll see my hand is gonna get very close to this edge over here. So I'm just gonna do like a 2 score thing because I don't wanna get too close to this edge. So right like that. Do another little one like that, and then that's good to go. If you want to like add some like little decorations, you can, with like some little mark like that, a little wheat ear or whatever you want. You can do almost anything. So now we're gonna lid these back up and get them in the oven. Okay, so now we're putting these back in the oven. We got our preheated pots with our breads inside, and we're just gonna stick them both in there. So right now, the bread's been in there around 25 minutes. So the lids are on, they're in those little chambers. So I'm gonna carefully pull this out a little bit. And right now we're just taking the lids off so that the doughs can start to color. So with this one, it's a little bit more difficult because the bottom is the top. So I like to take it out just so that I don't accidentally drop the lid. And so I'm taking it out. You can see our loaf right there, and we'll just set it right back in there. This one, the lid is much easier to take off, so you can just kind of pull it off. And you can see we got our loaf in there. It looks really nice. So we're gonna tuck these back in and they're gonna start to color. I know that my oven heats a lot from the bottom, so a thing that I like to do when I bake in this pot is I like to slip the pot lid right back underneath so that it absorbs some of that heat coming up. Because otherwise, I've accidentally burned the bottom of the bread before, and that's always disappointing. And I'm also gonna turn my oven down. So depending on your oven, like I know my oven runs a little bit cool, so I'm gonna turn it down to like 475. But anywhere between like 450, between like 425 and 475, you'll just get kind of a feel from your oven. You want the bread to color on top, but you don't want to roast the bottom too much. And so it's kind of a balance, and you'll figure it out with your oven. It's like, you know, some ovens, they just scorch from the top, so you may know that you need to put it lower in your oven. I like to keep mine a little bit higher off the bottom because that's where most of my heat's coming from in my oven. But you know your own oven, so you'll kind of get the placement and the temperature yourself. Okay, so we got our loaves. You can see, I was talking about my oven heats a little bit from the bottom, so you can see it's a little bit burnt, but there's one, he's a little bit flat, but that's all right. And then here's our second one. We did the little funny score on it. And there's that guy. And you just wanna, you don't want them to sit on the, they're gonna steam and crackle a little bit, so you want them to sit off of the surface. So I have them on a little cooling rack right here.